Well, thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We're here to talk about our consultation on the future approach to quality regulation. I'm Jess Bacon. I'm one of the managers in the TEF team, and I'll be talking today with my colleagues Graham and Catherine, and then introduce themselves when I come to them in a few minutes. So today, as I said, you'll have seen we recently published proposals on our future approach to quality regulation. So the purpose of today's session is to give you a bit more information about that and to allow you to ask some questions. I should say it is geared at people that have taken part in TEF before, so the content is kind of geared towards that as well. I appreciate some people might have come to this one because the date's better, but just bear that in mind that we've geared the content towards people that have taken part before. We did run a seminar on Friday for providers that haven't participated in TEF before, and the recording and the slides for that are on our website if anybody wants to take a look at that. So as I said, this is a chance for us to share information. Not really treating this one as a sort of formal feedback session. So there will be some events where if you prefer to give your feedback via an event, you can do that later in November. And I'll talk more about those at the end. And obviously we've got the usual way of feeding back through our consultation survey. So just to run through some housekeeping notes about how the session is going to work. We are a very big group today. It's a very popular session today. So that means we're going to be using the Q&A function to manage questions. So the chat function will be turned off, but there's a Q&A button, hopefully you can see on the top of your screen. You can submit questions through that, and you can do that throughout any point in the session. If there are some very sort of straightforward or easier questions, OfS colleagues might answer them in the chat as we go through, but otherwise there'll be time for a Q&A session after our slides. We won't be using the raise hand function, so we will just purely be using the Q&A box, and that's just because of the volume of people with us today. That's just an easier way for us to manage questions. And we may well sort of group questions into themes so that we can get through as many as possible. We won't be able to answer any questions about individual cases or providers. So if you have anything like that you were hoping to raise, you can contact us separately. The best address for questions is tef@officeforstudents.org.uk. And similarly, as I said, it's probably going to be quite a busy session. We might not get through every question. So if we run out of time to get to your question, do email us after today. A couple more points. The session will be recorded today, and as I said at the start, we're putting all of our webinar recordings up on our website. So if you submit a question through Q&A, it won't appear on the recording. We will just be reading those questions out, and we won't be reading names out. And I also should have said on the Q&A function, there's a upvoting sort of mechanism. So if you particularly like the look of a question, you can also vote for it, which is useful because it helps us prioritize the questions as well. If you have any technical difficulties during the session, you can contact our events team, which is events@officeforstudents.org.uk. And closed captions are also available, so you can get to them through the More button at the top of the screen, the 3 dots, and then you can choose open or turn on live captions. And finally, at the end of the session, we will be sharing a link for a really short feedback questionnaire, which is just an opportunity to get your sort of immediate thoughts on how the session has gone. So that is it for housekeeping, and I'm going to hand over to Graham at this point.
Thank you very much, Jess. Just waiting until I appear on screen. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really glad to be here to talk to you about our proposals on the future quality system. I'm Graham Rosenberg. I have been involved in running the TEF since it began back in about 2017, and I also oversee our work on student outcomes, also known as Condition B3. I'm going to talk about a bit of a background to the consultation and then start getting into the proposals, and then I'll pass on to my colleagues to continue. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So a little bit of background. I'm sure, as you know, one of the key things we do as a regulator is assess and regulate quality with the aim of ensuring that students from all backgrounds have a high quality experience and can achieve positive outcomes. What do we mean by quality? Well, it's essentially defined in our B conditions of registration. And here is a very, very short summary of what those B quality conditions are. It's about courses that are well designed and are delivered and assessed effectively. That's B1 and a bit of B4. B2 is about academic support and resources that students need to succeed, as well as effective engagement with students. And then condition B3 is about students achieving positive outcomes. If we move on to the next slide, our current approach to assessing quality for providers that are already registered falls into sort of two streams, essentially. So where we have significant concerns about a provider not meeting one of those B conditions, we carry out a targeted and very risk-based assessment that is in depth and goes into the detail of the particular concerns. If it's about B1 or 2, we go in and we do have a team of assessors that go in and visit the provider. If it's about condition B3, that's more quantitative, and we look at the outcomes data as well as evidence submitted by the provider. So those are targeted risk-based assessments. We published our reports whenever we complete them. And then alongside that, we run the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, which which this event is aimed at people who've already participated. So in last exercise was in 2023. 227 providers currently have TEF ratings from that exercise. And that was about recognizing excellence above the B conditions. If we move on to the next slide. So I suppose the question you might be wondering is, well, why are we proposing now to make a number of changes to the system? Well, a large part of the answer to that is that there was a public bodies review of the Office for Students that reported last year. That's an independent review commissioned by the government. And it came up with a number of recommendations about how the OfS can improve the way we work. And in relation to quality, made some key recommendations, particularly around those two separate streams of assessment activity I was just talking about. Recommended that we develop a more integrated approach so that it's more coherent, understandable, both to providers and to students, and provides a clearer view about different levels of quality offered by different institutions. It also recommended we focus more strongly on driving continuous improvement across the sector. So since that review was concluded, we had discussions with a number of bodies from the sector and student groups. We talked around a number of different ideas about how we could take forward those recommendations and develop a more integrated approach. And what we published recently was a set of proposals for a more integrated system. But it is what we see as the first of two stages of consultation. So at this stage, we're consulting on the overall scope and structure of the future system. And we do plan next year to consult in more detail about the methodology and the guidance and the details of the data that would be involved in taking it forward. So if we can move on to the next slide. So throughout these proposals, there are a number of things we're trying to improve in the way we regulate quality. Firstly, we would like the system to have wider reach. And essentially so that when we regulate and assess quality, students at all providers benefit from that external scrutiny. We also want to extend the reach beyond undergraduate students, which the current TEF covers, to also include postgraduate students in future. We'd like the system to have more impact in driving improvement across the sector as a whole. So as you'll see shortly, we want to strengthen the incentives and the interventions of the TEF ratings. We'd also like to strengthen input from students so that where the system drives improvements, it's focusing on the things that matter most to students. Thirdly, I've already mentioned a more coherent and integrated system. We'll talk about that shortly. And finally, we'd like a system that is more responsive. We recognise that some of what we do is based on lagged data, and the current TEF was designed to take place once every 4 years, but things can change more rapidly than that in providers. So we'd like a system that's more dynamic and is more responsive as changes take place. So if we move on to the next slide, um, that this is a sort of a quick overview of the current TEF, and it's essentially some of the key features of the TEF that we don't propose to change. So things that we expect to, or we propose to carry forward into the next TEF. I won't go through it in detail because if you've already taken part in the TEF, you should be familiar with this. But essentially, what we propose is to carry on with TEF as a desk-based exercise based on indicators and submissions from providers and their students in a way that takes account of context, assessed by academics and students to generate ratings which are awarded at the level of the whole provider, but taking into account performance for different subjects and different student groups. And the main aim of the exercise, I think, continues to be that it's meant to incentivize continuous improvement. It also generates useful information to students at provider level, so we would expect to be looked at alongside other more detailed information. We can move on to the next slide. So I went through the background fairly quickly because I'd like to focus more on talking about what proposals we're making to change the system. So everything that follows from now on are proposals that we're making. I know we've had a few questions in advance already about how are different elements of the system going to work. Well, we can't quite tell you yet how anything's going to work because we're in consultation mode, we're in listening mode, we're just putting out proposals, and we'd like your views and your feedback before we make any of those decisions. Okay, so let's make a start then on the proposals. If we move on to the next slide, starting with the scope of the assessment, we propose that all providers registered with the OfS should in future be assessed in the TEF. Last time, as you were aware, providers with fewer than 500 students could optionally take part, but we're proposing all providers should in future. Now, that does mean that there would be a much larger number that we'd be assessing, probably around double the number of providers that took part last time. So we do propose that it should move to a rolling cycle whereby we assess a certain number of providers each year, and colleagues will talk about that a bit more later. So why are we proposing this? Well, we think that students at all providers should benefit from high quality and from the external scrutiny that TEF provides to help drive up that quality. In the first cycle, what we're proposing is that we focus on undergraduate courses, so therefore all providers that offer undergraduate courses would be assessed in the first cycle. Then in the second cycle, we're proposing to extend to also include postgraduate taught students. So if there are providers that only teach postgraduate taught students, they would be picked up in the second cycle. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Just wait for the, yeah, that's the one. So assessing all registered providers does mean that there would be a very diverse range of providers that we're assessing, providers with very different sizes and characteristics, with very different student populations. So we do want to make sure that the assessment takes account of this diversity. It's been one of the main themes that we've been discussing with various groups before we put out the proposals. So essentially, we think that the assessment does need to build in context. It builds it into the data through benchmarking. And of course, the submissions from providers and their students are focused on the particular context of the provider. And we want to make sure we appoint a very diverse range of assessors to carry out the assessments. We do make some specific proposals, and we're really interested in feedback from smaller and specialist and college-based providers, particularly around trying to simplify the range of information that's submitted, focusing more on student experience, from thinking carefully about what we do where the data is limited, and also thinking about student submissions. We know from the past that there are particular challenges for students where there isn't an established students' union. And as I've said, recruiting assessors from all types of providers. So we welcome feedback on all of those areas. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So I've talked about providers in scope. We also put out proposals about what provision should be in scope. And as I've said in the first cycle, we propose to focus on undergraduate level courses, and not really much change compared to the last TEF in terms of the undergraduate scope. However, there is a question mark or a question we're putting out there about whether or not apprenticeships should be included, because apprenticeships at all levels are assessed by Ofsted, and there's a question about how should we avoid dual regulation of apprenticeships. So we welcome feedback on that. The other change we're proposing is the way we look at partnership students. So in the last TEF, students were included, whether they were taught by the provider or taught through a partnership or validated, that they were all within the scope. But what we're proposing this time is to make those two groups more distinct in the data. So we'd have one data set that looks at all the students taught by the provider, and alongside that data on all the students taught through partnership arrangements. The focus of the assessment, as you'll see shortly, is very much on quality as defined in the relevant B conditions. But there is a question we're asking feedback on around how far we think we can reduce the scope of APPs in future, access and participations in future, because in some ways the TEF is picking up the P part, the participation part of APPs. Essentially what we're saying here is that although the rating is for the whole provider, in order to generate that rating, the assessment does look at the data for all the different student groups within a provider, and we are suggesting that the criteria for a high rating, for a gold or silver rating, has a stronger emphasis on consistency across student groups. So you can see that the TEF would be doing a lot of work in driving up quality for underrepresented and disadvantaged student groups, and therefore the thinking is that perhaps we can have less focus on that in APPs in future. But we invite feedback on that suggestion. In the next cycle, I've said we propose to extend it to include postgraduate taught and modular provision. And then in later cycles, we'd like to design the process so that it could potentially expand further, for example, to T&E, or expand into other themes around wider student support or well-being, for example. But we're not making specific proposals on those things at this stage. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Catherine, who is going to continue talking about the proposals. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm Catherine. I'm one of the other managers in the TEF team, and I'm to talk through the proposals for aspects of assessment and ratings and the evidence that we would base assessments on. So we're proposing to retain the two aspects of assessment that we had in the last TEF, student experience and student outcomes, and to use the same ratings that we used in the last TEF as well. So gold, silver, bronze, and requires improvement. But our proposals involve aligning what is assessed under each aspect more closely with the relevant B conditions and aligning the ratings with the minimum quality requirements. So in future, bronze would effectively mean meeting the minimum requirements. And this is one of the big shifts from the last TEF, whereas in the past, bronze indicated high quality. In future, it would signify sufficient or an acceptable level of quality. Silver would mean typically high quality, and gold would mean typically outstanding quality. And as Graham said, to achieve these higher ratings, providers would need to demonstrate consistent levels of quality, and that would be across their student groups, subjects, modes of provision, and across all the areas that were assessed in the aspect. A provider would be rated requires improvement if the assessment concluded it didn't meet the minimum requirements. And then for student outcomes, we then go on to determine if there'd been a breach of condition B3. But if we think there are concerns about a provider meeting the more qualitative conditions, so those we'd be looking at under the student experience, we think that would likely require further investigation, including a visit to the provider. And finally, it's not shown on the slide, to retain an overall rating, but to take a different approach to how we arrive at that. So we're proposing a rules-based approach where the overall rating would be based on the lowest aspect rating rather than involving consideration of additional criteria. And that's largely based on the feedback we've had about how those the additional effort involved in arriving at that overall rating. If move on to the next slide. So we're not proposing a lot of change to the student experience aspect beyond aligning the coverage with the relevant conditions, so B1, B2 and B4, and the changes that I've explained to the rating descriptions. The assessment would continue to be based on provider submissions, benchmarked NSS indicators and direct input, either in the form of the student submission or the alternative that Graham mentioned. Where we have insufficient NSS data, so that's something you mentioned about varying in the approach, where we have limited data for the student experience aspect, we're proposing to collect student views in another way, and we've invited feedback on what the most appropriate way of doing that might be. And all providers would be rated for the student experience aspect. Right, so moving on, the next slide has some examples of the ratings criteria for student experience, and the ones that are here are for academic support and physical and digital learning resources, and these show how these might differ across the different ratings. So assessing, triangulate the evidence that we've talked about to judge which description best applies. And then to reach the aspect rating, they would consider whether across all of the criteria, student experience is either sufficient quality, high quality, or outstanding quality. And as I've mentioned, the extent to which that's consistent for all their students. So we've included these proposed criteria in the consultation, but they're very much our initial thoughts, and we would invite feedback on them, and particularly where we can achieve greater differentiation between the ratings. And can we move on to the next slide, please? So for student outcomes, we're proposing to include consideration of whether a provider is meeting our minimum requirements for student outcomes, so no longer to carry out set assessments, and to simplify B3 by no longer setting minimum thresholds for the progression measure and only to set these for continuation and completion. So a provider could only get a bronze rating if it's meeting those minimum thresholds or can justify why it doesn't. Otherwise, it would get a requires improvement rating, though obviously that we'd apply a materiality test to that. And then for providers that meet the thresholds in deciding which rating to award, we're proposing to continue to use benchmarked progression alongside continuation and completion, but to introduce a wider set of benchmark post-study indicators so we rely less heavily on it. We've proposed 2 new measures in the consultation. One of those is a salary measure based on the LEO data, and the other one is a measure responses to the question in the graduate outcomes survey about the extent to which graduates are using what they learned in their studies in their current activity. So we're proposing to align the scope of this aspect more closely with B3 and not to continue with the approach to educational gains that we started with in the last TEF. We recognise that there are mixed views about educational gains, and some providers have invested a lot of effort in developing their approaches and measurement of these. We do think there's value in continuing with this, but in terms of the assessment, because it would lead to proliferation of different approaches, that would involve burden for providers and difficulty for assessors in assessing and rating it in a robust way. And we've given those considerations weight in arriving at our proposals. So providers would be able to supply contextual information that relates directly to outcomes indicators, but not alternative evidence in the way that they were able to in the last TEF. We're also proposing that students are no longer asked to comment on student outcomes in their submissions, and Jess will say a bit more about that shortly. And the more streamlined approach, which is based more on data indicators, we're hoping that that would be significantly less burdensome for providers and assessors, and also allow for greater comparability across the ratings. So we do recognise the limitations of a more data-led approach, and that both the benchmarking approach and the consideration of context are going to be very important in getting this right. So because of the approach we're proposing to assessing student outcomes with greater reliance on comparable data, where we don't have sufficient data indicators, we're proposing that we wouldn't assess and rate outcomes. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So as well as integrating B3 data and assessment into TEF assessments, we're proposing to revise and simplify condition B3. So I've talked about no longer continuing to set minimum thresholds for progression. We're also proposing to tighten up the context that we consider in future when deciding if below threshold performance is justified. And that's a change we would need to introduce after a suitable transition period. So under our proposals, we'd no longer consider actions taken or future plans at this point, because we think if a provider says that they plan to do X, Y, and Z, that doesn't really justify that students up to that point have not been getting good outcomes. So we don't plan to consider when considering if there has been performance below threshold. But when we move on to consider following a requires improvement outcome, whether there has been a breach or there's a risk of future breach, and the action that we might take as a result of that, we would consider actions taken or planned by the provider at that point. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And finally, from me, just to recap on our proposals for what we would do where data is limited. So we've set out in the consultation some criteria or tests we might apply to decide where data would be insufficient, as we put it. And this generally relates to where data is unavailable, where there are high levels of statistical uncertainty around it, or where a large proportion of a provider's students aren't within the population for the indicator, because a lot of their students aren't in scope for the NSS, for example. So where there's insufficient NSS data for a provider, what we're proposing is we would still assess and rate the student experience based on student views and the provider submission. We'd collect student views in another way, and that might include online meetings or commission focus groups, and we'd like input, as I said, on how we might do that. And in those evidence collecting mechanisms, we would be trying to obtain evidence about the same things that students would be commenting on in the NSS, so we would have a comparable type of information to consider. If there's insufficient student outcomes data for a provider, we're proposing not to assess or rate the student outcomes aspect. It wouldn't have any impact on the provider's overall rating. They'd still get an overall rating, but it'd be based on experience rating, and we recognise in doing this it would be very important for us to present the absence of any rating neutrally when we publish the outcomes. Right, I think I am handing over to Jess now.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on some more of the detail around our proposals. So starting with provider submissions, I'll talk through this quite quickly because we're not actually proposing something very different to how this operated in the past. Other than, as we have touched on, we think the focus for the provider submission would likely be more on the student experience aspect. So for student outcomes, the provider could put in contextual information around the data, but we wouldn't be expecting alternative or supplementary sort of data-based information to the indicators we're using. So as it says here, we're kind of proposing the same broad structure as these submissions had last time. Also that we would retain a page limit. I think I saw a question pop up about that in the chat. So last time around, the page limit was 25 pages, and we set a page limit basically to try and sort of focus the information we're getting, try and avoid undue sort of burden on providers in sort of very long submissions, but not unduly constraining you from putting in the information you want to. One of our questions in the proposals is, could we reduce that page limit? So there are some areas where we are sort of proposing detail come out, or the submissions are much more focused. So that is one option we're considering as well. Next slide, please. So Catherine and Graham have touched on this a bit already, but we just wanted to reiterate that the student involvement in the whole assessment process remains really important to us. We want to build and sort of consolidate what we achieved on this last time. So we are proposing we carry on with the student submissions. We see this as really important to provide a route to getting more direct evidence from the student body. Last time we suggested these were coordinated by a named student contact, and it's likely we'll do the same again. And as I said, we do see them as important to the whole process. We think they can supplement the NSS data in a useful way. So they might sort of highlight specific issues or areas of importance to your provider students. And it also allows the assessment to consider views of students that we might not get through the NSS indicators, and that might be students at the sort of earlier stage of their studies, which sometimes aren't picked up by NSS. This is one area that we would suggest is more focused than the previous time we ran TEF, so it would only be focused on student experience and not student outcomes. And this is in a large part responding to feedback and evaluation we did of the last TEF, where we had feedback from student representatives that it was quite hard or challenging for them to give sort of useful content around student outcomes in their student submissions. I think Catherine touched on this, but we're retaining that student submissions are optional, but we really want to encourage some form of student submission or way of getting that student voice at all participating providers. So one of our questions is, if a student submission wasn't feasible, what alternative mechanism could we use to get student views another way? And that might be the case where if we have providers where their sort of student representation structures are less formal or less well developed, that might be the kind of scenario where it's challenging to provide a student submission. Next slide, please. So again, we touched on this earlier, but just to provide a bit of information around what we see the assessment cycle looking like. So as it says in our proposals, this is a kind of rolling cyclical approach. And that's because of the expansion of the scope and the number of providers we want to look at. We don't think we know we wouldn't be able to assess every provider across 1 year. So this means we're looking at a first cycle of sort of 3 or 4 years to get through all of our registered providers. And this means we need to consider who we would look at assessment. We think we could probably do around 100 providers in that year. And as our proposal set out, we're sort of suggesting it would likely be providers who'd either received an overall bronze rating before or one bronze aspect in their ratings. And there may also be providers that we want to look at because of our sort of wider regulatory intelligence, monitoring information we hold, where we think there's possibly some risk to the student experience appearing that we want to look at. Beyond the first cycle, we think that the frequency would depend on rating and risk. So you'll see here, we are proposing that if you receive gold and silver, you'd have sort of longer intervals between assessment, but shorter intervals for the other ratings. And the idea behind that is that we would put sort of greater scrutiny in areas where we think there's potentially higher risk to students, but also if those providers might want to come in more quickly to give them a chance to sort of have their ratings reassessed as well. Next slide, please. So Graham talked a bit about this at the start, about sort of one of the main drivers behind the whole system and the fact that we want TEF to have more impact. Also that we want it to drive improvement and particularly improvement for students. So some of you might have been at some of our earlier mission group meetings we held, but one of our early proposals was that we might have an additional separate rating or aspect based on continuous improvement. We had kind of mixed views and mixed responses to that. Some people were keen, some less so, but there was a general worry that it would create burden, sort of complicate the assessment further, and it was a bit unclear how we could kind of assess and grade that kind of area robustly. So instead, we're not proposing to have that as a completely separate aspect, but we do still want to think about what might drive that improvement up to the higher ratings. So as it says here in our proposals, we've set out potential interventions and incentives such as longer gaps between assessments for the higher ratings, obviously standard reputational benefits, also potential eligibility for some different kinds of funding streams in the future, and for sort of greater access to unrestricted DAPs as well. And as I said, it's all with the idea that we drive that improvement, but also drive that improvement beyond the bronze rating. Arguably, you could say in our previous system, there was no sort of really strong reason or strong incentive for a provider to need to get above bronze, other than the possible reputational effects. So the reason for the sort of strengthened incentives in the top ratings is because we do want to encourage providers to climb above bronze. The approach also talks about how we might identify cases that we might want to look at more closely. So as we already touched on, alongside TEF, we would be carrying on with our usual sort of monitoring work and quality assessment work. The proposals also set out a kind of risk framework or monitoring tool that we might use to identify cases where we think there is a higher risk to quality. And so either through that ongoing monitoring or through the TEF process, we might identify providers that we want to work with more closely. And that could be through, varying methods, through sort of more proactive engagement, through to thinking about whether, more investigatory work or quality compliance type assessments are required. And that would be more likely to happen through TEF if a provider receives the requires improvement rating, but would also be possible in the bronze rating as well. Next slide, please. So we've just got a few more slides before we move to Q&A. We just wanted to flash up our timeline here. So we are in the middle of our first stage consultation, which closes in December. And as Graham mentioned earlier, this is one of a two-part consultation. So the idea is we would then work towards the second consultation launching in autumn next year, and with the idea that the first batch of assessments would start in summer 2027. So this is the timeline that's set out in our proposals currently. We do conscious, this is quite a lot of work, but if we can streamline anywhere and try and sort of deliver things sooner, we will. with the idea that we would publish sort of more final information on timelines in the second stage consultation. Next slide, please. So just to finish off now, as it says here, we are really keen to hear your views. So you can do that in the usual way through our online survey, but we will have some events where we are using those as feedback sessions. I'll touch on those in a moment. And just to say, we have asked quite a lot of questions on different areas in the consultation document, so you don't have to respond to all of those questions. You can sort of comment on areas of particular interest if you wanted to. We're also really keen to get student feedback. We are doing a lot of student engagement ourselves, but really helpful if you could encourage your student representatives at your own provider to share their views as well. Next slide, please. So these are just some details on our event. So we have got an in-person event in Coventry on the 18th of November, and that's for anybody, so all of our different groups of providers and students and student reps and so on that might be interested. We will also be holding another webinar aimed at previous TEF participants on the 27th of November. And these are opportunities. We will sort of collect formal feedback on the proposals through those events as well. And you can register our events page. And yes, as I said at the start, if you would rather not raise your question today or we don't get to it, you can get in touch with us afterwards at that TEF email address there. So I think that is it for the formal slides, and we're going to move to Q&A. So let me just move to that. So we might, hopefully Graham will appear. There he is. We did have a few questions submitted in advance, so we might start with a few of those while we're organising the other questions in the background. And I think also as we've been going through, I've seen more questions coming in this area in the chat. So we have had quite a few on the interaction with our A&P work. So some general questions about how do we view the sort of proposals intersecting with the APP cycle and assessments and so on. Hopefully we've answered that a little bit in the presentation today, but Graham might want to expand. And then we had a question, obviously Graham was talking earlier about possibly in the future we might think that the participation aspect is looked at more through TEF than through A&P work. And we had a question about are we not concerned that might lead to a reduction in focus in this area? And how would we ensure that providers maintain their focus in this important area?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so I think I did talk a little bit more about our thinking that TEF could potentially cover a large part of the participation element of APPs. But as mentioned, one of the questions are quite right. We're not proposing an attainment measure in the TEF, so that would be a difference. That would be something that wouldn't be covered. So we welcome feedback on how far we can go in reducing the duplication and reducing overlap of APPs. But it's, yeah, I think I've said what we've set out, and we welcome your views on it.
Okay. Thanks, Graham. Then we've had quite a few questions around TEF ratings. So will the overall award be the key going forward, or will there still be an award for student experience or outcomes separately? Again, something we touched on, but you might, I'm conscious we went over the slides very quickly, so you might want to.
Yes, yeah, although I do also want to try and answer questions quite quickly because there are a lot of them to get through. So, so yes, we are proposing to rate student experience and to rate student outcomes. And we did think about whether actually we need an overall rating at all, because at one level it doesn't add a huge amount of information. But in the end, we thought because there are some stronger incentives that we want to attach to TEF ratings, it's much more straightforward to do that with an overall rating. But we didn't want to create a lot of extra work for the assessors in trying to weigh everything up all over again in order to come to an overall rating. So we proposed a much simpler approach to producing the overall rating.
So we did have a follow-up question, which I think actually you've just answered, saying we're still using language such as interpreting or weighing up when we talk about the work the assessors do. So is there a particular reason why we moved to a rules-based approach for the overall rating? But
yeah, well, yes, I sort of touched on it. We found an experience, the experience of the last TEF, wherever a provider had a different rating for experience and outcomes, the panel members had to spend quite a lot of time revisiting all of the evidence to weigh everything up all over again to come to an overall rating, because there wasn't any straightforward way of saying, well, it's silver on one, gold on the other, what's the overall? So it's a lot of extra work, but as I've already suggested, it doesn't really provide a huge amount of extra information. So we think, just to try and keep costs and burden down, let's try and come up with a simpler approach. But the other reason is that we are suggesting in future gold and silver has a stronger emphasis on consistency. So the logic of that is, if it's silver on one aspect, gold on the other, it can't be gold consistently by definition. So the logic is that it would be silver overall.
yeah, that's answered a follow-up question that I was about to ask, so that's helpful. Thank you. We also had a question: what is the rationale for keeping gold, silver, and bronze? Have we considered moving to something like outstanding, high quality, sufficient? With a comment that in sport, bronze is synonymous with being awarded a third place, not meeting a minimum standard.
Yes, I mean, you could argue that we should move to kind of words that describe the ratings. We did find that when we tested with students, and this was after the Pierce review, the independent review, we tested various options with students, and students found gold, silver, bronze to be pretty clear. So that's essentially why we're proposing to stick with it. But again, as with all things, we welcome feedback.
Thank you. We had a question again on ratings, by altering the definition of bronze from high quality to satisfactory, there may be unintended consequences, potentially damaging the UK higher education brand on the international stage market. Has that potential impact been investigated?
So, I mean, it's an interesting point. We do think it's important that the UK is seen as high quality, because as a sector it is. But we also want to make sure that the system does drive up quality, and ultimately our ultimate aim is that as many students as possible receive a high quality experience. And we think that proposals we make where bronze is more clearly about meeting the minimum, and we want to drive that up to high quality, will be more effective at doing that. In terms of international reputation, I think it's an interesting discussion that could be had about what the effect might be. I mean, you could argue that by having quite a rigorous and tough regulatory system actually is also good for the reputation of the sector.
Thank you. We had a pre-submitted question around learning gain, and how does it fit in the revised TEF?
Yes, so I'm not sure there is a short answer to this particular question. As you know, we started off with educational gain in the last TEF, and we did at that stage signal that we thought providers would need to then start developing their own measures to submit to the following TEF. We discussed this quite a lot in the lead up to the consultation with various groups. There were sort of mixed views about, some thought it would be valuable to continue down that path, could see the value in their own institutions of developing that work. And I think we could see there would be value in doing it, because it does add to the kind of standard measures we have of outcomes. But what we did in our proposals really was weigh up those additional benefits against the cost and complexity of continuing down that path. And especially if we're now expanding TEF to all providers, the idea of all providers having to develop their own measures and not just develop the measures, but then actually measure educational gain in different ways in every provider, and then try to assess it. It's quite costly for the sector. It's quite complex for the assessors to have so many different measures. So ultimately, we thought the extra cost and complexity wasn't worth the additional benefit to be gained from continuing down the path. So we have, as you've seen, proposed a much more straightforward way of assessing student outcomes next time.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions around submissions and the balance between data and other information. So if the approach is more data-led, does this imply that provider and student submissions are less likely to influence TEF outcomes than in the previous round?
Yeah, I think what we're suggesting is the student outcomes element would be more data-led, because we're suggesting we look at student outcomes that are fairly factual, factual events, so whether students complete their studies, whether they go on to certain types of jobs, etc. And that can be measured in a way that takes account of context through benchmarking. So we think that could be more data-led. The student experience aspect, we don't think would be any more data-led than the last TEF. We think actually that there's still a lot of weight on provider submissions and direct student input alongside the NSS for student experience.
And a linked question. So in TEF 23, the guidance was very clear that data could only inform 50% of the rating. What proportion of future TEF would the provider and student submission count for? Clarity here would aid resource allocation within unis.
Yeah, well, I mean, we haven't gone into the detail yet of exact weightings, but I think what I just said, you can sort of infer that we're not proposing much change really in terms of student experience. But for student outcome, we are proposing a more data-led approach that takes account of context, but the measures themselves are a sort of comparable set of measures.
We have got a sort of batch of questions around apprenticeships and other regulatory activity. So the current consultation leaves open whether apprenticeships will be in scope. If they are, will the NSS be adjusted to address better their learning contexts and needs?
That's an interesting question. I think a similar one came up the other day. So I think that's something we'd have to think about. I think we'd have to go away and look at how well the NSS works for apprenticeship students. It's not something I've looked at yet, but something I intend to.
And I think we had a comment in our presentation around thinking carefully about apprenticeships because of the prospect of dual regulation. So the question is, have we considered the same point for other provision that has Ofsted inspections, for example, initial teacher education?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's something we hadn't picked up in our previous discussions. So I think, yes, feed that back in the consultation is something we'll look at.
And then it might be the same question, but it might be around scheduling. Will there be any consideration where providers receive other regulatory activity like Ofsted inspections? So I'm not quite sure if that's about when we might go in and assess them or the extent of the assessment. But
yeah, if it's about scheduling, what we are suggesting is that there could be some circumstances or some events happening where it leads us to decide, okay, we won't put the provider into the TEF in that particular year. I think the most obvious examples we give, say, where there's a structural merger going on, for example. With Ofsted inspections, we're not suggesting that would automatically mean that a provider shouldn't be assessed in that year. We do think that providers generally ought to be capable of dealing with multiple regulatory requirements happening, and particularly the scope of the TEF would be looking at something different to an Ofsted inspection.
thank you. We've got a batch of questions around student outcomes and indicators. So I think the question is, what will the methodology and weighting be for the proposed new B3 progression metric? But I think that's actually probably referring to the new post-study indicators we've set up.
Yeah, so we're suggesting that there would be a more rounded basket of measures of what happens after graduation, so the progression, use of skills, and salary are the three things we've proposed. But again, we're open to ideas and feedback. We are trying to look at things that are available from existing data sources without any new additional data collections. And we are looking at things that are meaningful, that students and graduates actually care about. But we do think that placing too much weight on any one of those measures wouldn't be quite right, because none of those measures provides a complete view, and there are graduates with different intentions and different ambitions. So we think a rounded set of measures, each of which tells you something slightly different, that would then need to be put together. In terms of methodology, we're proposing that we would use our existing benchmarking methodology for each of those measures. There is a question about what factors to use in all of them. So that's some work we will do, and we will consult in the next consultation next year about the details about what benchmarking factors. So, for example, we think we should take account of region when looking at salaries, for example, but how do we define region, and so on, those kind of questions. Weighting, we haven't suggested at this stage any particular weighting, other than what I've already said, that they ought to be looked at in the round. I think weighting is probably a question we would come to in the next consultation.
We've had a couple of questions and comments around sort of lags in the data. So one, some of the data suggested, e.g. Leo, will have a significant lag compared to current performance. How will this be dealt with in the submission? So that I guess they either mean how should they deal with it in the submission, or how will the assessors deal with it?
Yes, so we recognise that the outcome measures are all in some way sort of retrospective. Continuation obviously is the most sort of up-to-date one, but all of the others, completion and post-study or employment measures, are all retrospective. And I think we're fairly upfront about that in one of the sections of the consultation, about having an assessment of outcomes that is retrospective, because outcomes by their nature you can only really see after the event. But then a student experience aspect, which is more up to date and is more current. And the idea being that both of those things are rated, and we have incentives to drive up improvement. And yes, it may take time to drive up the outcomes data, but that can be done by improvements in the student experience, which perhaps would be seen more quickly, and then those improvements to experience would lead to improvements in outcomes over time. But that's our kind of theory, part of our theory of change, if you like. But again, we're interested in views.
Thank you. I had a sort of follow-up question on benchmarks. Given benchmarks are relative to sector performance, it's never going to be possible for all providers to be above bronze. Does that mean the OfS is intending to change the way benchmarks are calculated to make this possible?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting area to think through. That yes, benchmarks are relative, so that yes, there would always be some providers above and some below benchmark. I suppose the question I've been thinking about is, we do want to drive providers up to be high quality, to essentially push bronze providers up towards silver over time. Is it better to have a system whereby it's sort of, I guess you'd have to land up with sort of absolute criteria where everyone eventually can become silver, or does it drive continuous improvement to stick with this kind of more relative measures, where the providers that are bronze in theory will be driven to improve, but then that pushes up the sector averages, and there will always be those that fall below that then driven up to improve. So it leads to essentially a kind of long-term continuous improvement cycle.
That was quite a few about data, so I might try and touch on some other areas. So we had one around employability, and it says the consultation document recognises the importance of progression to students, yet employability doesn't appear to be covered by the experience aspect or the student submission. Is there a rationale for this?
Okay, well, that's an interesting one to pick up on, because I think actually employability and skills are covered by student experience. Part of it is about there's the curriculum content and design. Does it develop relevant skills and knowledge? That's one of the parts of the condition B1, and is therefore picked up in the TEF criteria. And then how are students supported to succeed and develop those skills? I think that essentially the experience that leads to positive employability outcomes is within the student experience aspect.
Okay. We've had a couple of questions around risk monitoring and the risk monitoring tool. So one around, it says it's looking at the recruitment of students with very low or no entry qualifications due to concerns over poorer continuation rates for full-time first degree students. Does that mean part-time students are excluded from this risk measure?
That's a good question. I think we'd have to have a look at what the part-time students data tells us.
Are we considering a list of reportable events that could trigger a new TEF review? The comment is, so many institutions going through major change at present, there's every possibility that multiple factors could impact on an institution which could change their context in a relatively short period, even if previously awarded gold or...
Yeah, so that's one of the things we do want to design into the system, that it can be more responsive. So if providers awarded gold, for example, we are suggesting that the highest quality providers have less frequent scrutiny. So the norm would be, or what we're proposing is, the norm would be reassessed 5 years later. But we will carry out ongoing monitoring, and the quality monitoring tool sets out the types of data we're proposing to look at. We would look at all providers on an ongoing basis and be able to spot if there are multiple issues, multiple risks flagging at a particular provider. If it's a gold provider, that could lead us to bringing it back for an assessment earlier than the 5 years.
Thank you. We've also had a question on partnerships. Will you be drawing distinctions between franchise, subcontracted provision and validated provision? If not, a bit of a concern, smaller providers and FE with HE providers might be disadvantaged. Validation arrangements are different to franchise agreements.
So yes, I can understand that the arrangements are different, but I think our view is that in either case, both partners have responsibility for those students, and it's the validating or franchising provider in either case, I think, has similar responsibilities in relation to quality. I mean, there may be differences in some other relationships with students, but in terms of oversight of quality, I think they're broadly similar. So we are suggesting that we bring together validated and subcontracted provision into a sort of single data set, but I imagine we'd split it between those two as well, so that any differences can also be seen. I think, I'm not sure we've got to that level of detail yet, but the next stage we will do.
And I guess link question, can you say any more about your proposals to separate out the provider taught and lead partner provision? So I think we touched on that in the presentation about the separate presentation of data.
Yes, this does get a little bit technical, because I'm trying to remember that the current TEF data has a particular set of kind of populations that it looks at. So the top level, it lumps together students that are either taught by or registered at the institution. So it includes students that are taught or franchised out. And then there's another partnership view, which is slightly different. I think what we're suggesting here is to have a cleaner two populations. One of those that the provider teaches, and one that other providers teach through a partnership arrangement, whether it's validated or franchised. What we do plan to do is start developing a more integrated set of data, so bringing B3 and TEF data more together, and with this new kind of views that are being trying to explain, perhaps not very well. But what we're proposed to do is publish early next year a sort of working version of how this might look, to get some feedback on it.
Thank you. You touched on B3 there. We've had a couple of questions around B3 and the introduction of LLE. So a couple around what impact do you think it might have? And are we kind of saying that we'd only really look at LLE in the second cycle, or do we think it's going to have an impact in the first cycle?
Yeah, so LLE funded modules, which are sort of where students are studying a module but not a whole qualification. We think that in the first cycle of TEF, I mean, this will be during the sort of first years of the sort of introduction of LLE funded modules. If you recall the policy, any modules that are fundable will need to be part of a parent qualification. And in the first cycle of TEF, all of those parent qualifications will be fully included within the TEF. So we think there's some sort of quality assurance going on there. But we do want in time to develop more specific measures of modular provision. And what we're proposing, at least at this stage, is that the first thing to look at is, are students completing the modules they sign up for? And that is something we'll be looking at, but we'd only really have the data available for that for the second cycle of the TEF.
Thank you. We had a question around condition B4. Will the credibility of awards over time element of B4 continue to be monitored and assessed separately?
Yes, that is something we do plan to continue to look at, but not it's separately. It is essentially the answer, rather than as part of TEF, because we don't think it's the kind of thing you could kind of rate as gold, silver, or bronze.
We've had a question around communication of ratings to students. So if the current TEF definitions are clear to students, how do you plan to communicate the changed definitions to avoid confusion and sustain shared understanding of sector strengths and areas of improvement?
So I think, yeah, I'm not sure I agree that the current definitions themselves are clear to students. I think that the rating names have a sort of clear resonance, if you like, but the definitions actually, we think the current bronze definition is actually quite complicated. It's sort of kind of high, yeah, partly high quality, yeah, partly above the B conditions, but we think actually that it'd be much clearer just to say they meet the minimum requirements. Silver and gold, when we tested with students, tested with applicants, actually they felt both silver and gold looked pretty good, but they didn't really have, you know, make such a clear distinction between the two, which was interesting. And I'm not sure necessarily that would change once we revise the definitions.
Yeah. Thank you. A question around time frame of the first cycle. Do we think the initial 3-year time frame to assess all providers is realistic, given the numbers of providers we're looking at?
I think it is a challenge. I think that, yeah, it's looking like about 150 providers per year for the first 3 years. And that's something that I am a little bit worried about. So yeah, we need to do some further work. There are a lot of the providers haven't taken part in the first, up to now in the TEF. So a lot of those would be new participants, and that's something that I'm still thinking about what the implications of that are.
Yeah. And some link questions on time frame. So with the proposals for sort of phased reassessment and the cycle, how will assessors be supported to judge performance? And it says here, since they'll be seeing a large number of one particular type of application. I'm not quite sure what that latter half means. I thought it might be a question around how assessors will sort of maintain their knowledge if they're seeing providers over a series, but.
Yeah, I suppose there's perhaps a slightly sort of wider question here, that the profile of providers being assessed in any given year might be different. And we are suggesting in the first year that we sort of prioritise certain categories, and then by the time we get to the sort of third year of the first cycle, we're probably going to be mostly providers that haven't taken part before. So the profile will shift, and then beyond that, it'll depend on whether providers got gold, silver, bronze the first time around. So we do need to think quite carefully about how we have a sort of pool of assessors that has a good mix of continuity from one year to the next, but also new people coming in from one year to the next, to anticipate that sort of change in profile of providers each year.
Yeah. We are nearing the end, but I think we've got probably time for a couple more questions. So a question around, we said in TEF 23 that with benchmarking, oh, sorry, it's moving around on my document. Hang on. That the UK higher education sector is on average very high quality, so that data that is broadly in line with the benchmark is consistent with TEF Silver. Are we planning to carry that on for revised TEF?
Yes, I think it's somewhere in the proposals for probably the criteria for student outcomes. I think we are essentially saying that silver would essentially be on benchmark, high quality.
We've had a question saying the OfS strategy covers points on a quality risks register, but this isn't mentioned at all in the proposals. So given it's in scope, I did expect to see more of it. There is actually, I'm going to answer this one because I know this one. There is actually information in the proposals on our sort of risk monitor. It's probably got a different name in our consultation proposals, but there is an annex which talks about our kind of risk management tool that we're proposing, which is basically what's covered by the OfS strategy as well. So yeah, if you want to have a look in the annexes, you'll find it there. So a few more minutes remaining. Just going to go through and see which ones I've missed. There's a question around I think it's kind of what use will we make of the reporting that providers have to do on meeting PSRB standards. So they obviously report on that and their achievements and experiences alongside, will they, well, I guess the question is, will they report on that alongside academic and university environment experience?
Yeah, again, I think it's a really interesting question about the relationship with PSRB accreditation and requirements. I mean, you don't need me to say, but they're very diverse in their standards they set and the way they accredit and what it is they look at and how they report on the outcomes. It's quite diverse, but I do think that there ought to be some space within the assessment to look at how evidence arising from those processes, how that can feed in. I think one of the things that, just reflecting back on the assessment last time, because we did have space for that within the submissions last time around, wasn't always entirely clear to the assessors whether meeting PSRB requirements meant that was sort of baseline quality or high quality or excellence. It possibly varies across different PSRBs, so I think there's a bit of work to do there to try and clarify some of that.
Yeah. I think we're going to have to stop there because we've got 1 minute remaining. So thank you for your very interesting questions. And I'm sorry, we probably didn't try to sort of bulk them into themes as much as I could to get through everything, but there may well be a few remaining. Do get in touch with us, as I said, afterwards if you didn't get a chance to have your question answered. Otherwise, as I touched on, we do have some events, more events coming up in November. We also, amongst the team, are trying to get out to all of sort of mission group and sector group meetings that you might be having over the next couple of months. So I'm sure you'll see us pop up at one of those. But otherwise, thank you very much. And we will be flashing up a link to a really short questionnaire, so you can just tell us how you found today, if it was helpful and so on. But otherwise, we will leave it there. So thank you very much, everybody.